10 daughters, 10 families, 10 homes that looked completely normal from the outside. Nice houses, good neighborhoods, parents who loved their children, birthday parties, family photos on the walls. Everything most people would look at and call a happy life. Behind every one of those front doors, a young woman was quietly building a plan. Not to run away, not to leave home, to stay, and to get rid of the family in her way. Some of them used boyfriends, some of them used girlfriends, some of them used paid strangers. A few of them picked up the blade themselves. They ranged from 12 years old to 32. They came from church families, wealthy families, broken families, and famous families. Across 5 different countries and nearly 50 years of history, every one of them made the same choice. They decided their family was worth less than what they wanted. These are 10 spoilt daughters who had their families killed. Case 1. Jennifer Pan. On a quiet street in Markham, Ontario, just north of Toronto, lived a family that most people would have called a Canadian success story. Han Pan and Bic Ha Pan had arrived in Canada in 1979 as refugees from Vietnam. They came with almost nothing. They found work at an auto parts factory called Magna International, where Han became a tool and die maker, and Bic made car parts on the assembly floor. Year after year, they saved every dollar they could. By 2004, they had bought a comfortable house with a 2-car garage in a safer suburb in the Greater Toronto area. They had 2 children, a son named Felix, born in 1989, and an older daughter named Jennifer, born in 1986. Jennifer was the child they put all their hopes into. From a young age, her life was built around their expectations. She took music theory and harmony lessons starting at age 12. She trained in figure skating almost every day of the week. Her parents hoped she would one day compete as an Olympic skater. That dream ended when Jennifer tore a ligament in her knee. At Mary Ward Catholic Secondary School, she played flute in the school band. She was the quiet, obedient daughter her parents wanted her to be, at least on the outside. The problem was that Jennifer was living a life her parents had designed for her, not a life she had chosen for herself. And by the age of 22, she had never gone to a club, never been drunk, never visited a friend's cottage, and never taken a single vacation without her family. What Jennifer's parents did not know was that their straight-A daughter was not actually getting straight A's. Her real grades were average, usually sitting around the 70s. So Jennifer did what a lot of scared teenagers do when they cannot face the shame of disappointing strict parents. She started lying. She forged her report cards. She handed them to her parents and watched them smile with pride at grades she had never actually earned. The lying worked, so she kept doing it. When Jennifer was in grade 12, she failed calculus. A university called Ryerson, which had offered her early admission, pulled that offer. Jennifer never told her parents. Instead, she pretended she was still going to Ryerson. Every morning she left the house with a backpack and textbooks. She did not go to class. She went to cafes where she sat for hours. She taught piano to younger kids for extra money. She worked shifts in a restaurant. Then she went home at the end of the day like a normal university student, ate dinner with her parents, and lied about what she had learned in her classes that day. The lie got bigger over time, the way lies usually do. Jennifer told her parents she had won scholarships. She told them she had been accepted into a pharmacology program at the University of Toronto. She bought second-hand pharmacology textbooks. She watched online videos about pharmacology so she could fill notebooks with fake class notes to show her parents if they ever asked. When she was supposed to be finishing her degree, she told her parents she had started volunteering at a children's hospital in Toronto. None of it was real. Jennifer Pan had never finished high school. She had never set foot in a university classroom as a student. For years, she lived 2 completely different lives under the same roof as the 2 people who thought they knew her best. While Jennifer was pretending to be a university student, she was also quietly falling in love. She had started dating a high school classmate named Daniel Wong. Daniel was of mixed Chinese and Filipino background. He lived in a town east of Toronto called Ajax. Daniel worked as a manager at a Boston pizza restaurant. He also sold marijuana on the side. Jennifer's parents did not approve of him. They did not want their daughter dating anyone at all, let alone someone they saw as a bad influence. But Jennifer kept seeing Daniel behind her parents' backs. She told her mother and father that she was staying near her university campus during the week with a female friend. In reality, she was staying with Daniel. The lies started to fall apart in 2010. Jennifer's mother, Bick, began to wonder why her daughter did not have a hospital ID badge or a uniform for her supposed volunteer job. So Bick did what any suspicious parent would do. She followed her daughter to work. What she found shattered everything she believed about Jennifer. There was no volunteer shift. There was no hospital job. The whole story, like almost every other story Jennifer had told them for years, was a lie. Han was furious. He wanted to throw Jennifer out of the house. Bick talked him out of it. Instead, they put Jennifer on what amounted to house arrest. She was told to finish high school. She was told to reapply to university. She was told she was not allowed to contact Daniel Wong ever again. For a while, Jennifer seemed to obey, but she and Daniel stayed in contact in secret, and Jennifer started to think about a very different kind of solution to her problem. By 2009, Daniel had grown tired of sneaking around. He broke up with Jennifer and started dating another woman. Jennifer did not take it well. She invented a wild story that a group of men had broken into her house, and she blamed the whole thing on Daniel's new girlfriend. It was all made up. None of it had happened, but it was enough to pull Daniel back into her life. By early 2010, the two of them were talking again, and that is when the plotting began. At first, Jennifer tried to hire a young man she had known from high school named Ricardo Duncan. According to what Jennifer said later, she paid him $1,500 to kill her father at his workplace. Ricardo denied it. He said she had only ever given him $200 for a night out, and that he had returned even that. He refused to hurt anyone. So Jennifer and Daniel came up with a bigger plan. They would hire a real contract killer for $10,000. If Jennifer's parents were dead, she would inherit around $500,000. She and Daniel could finally be together. They could move in as a couple. They could live the life her parents had never let her have. Daniel connected Jennifer with a man named Lenford Roy Crawford. Daniel gave her a separate phone and a SIM card so she could speak to Lenford without the calls showing up on her regular phone records. Lenford brought in another man, Eric Carty. Eric brought in a third man, David Milvaganam. The plan was locked in. On the night of November 8, 2010, Jennifer unlocked the front door of her parents' house when she went up to bed. She then made a phone call to one of the men. A short time later, 3 armed strangers walked through that unlocked front door. Jennifer's parents were asleep upstairs. Jennifer stayed where she was and let the plan unfold. The 3 men searched the house for cash. They went upstairs. They pulled Han and Bick out of bed and forced them down to the basement. Then they opened fire. Bick was hit several times and did not survive her injuries. Han was also shot and was left for dead, but somehow he was still breathing when the men left. The men took around $2,000 in cash from Jennifer herself to make the scene look like a robbery gone wrong. They walked out the front door. Jennifer called 911 and told the operator that 3 men had broken into her house, attacked her parents, and tied her up. But there were already problems with her story. She had dialed 911 with her hands supposedly bound. She had not been shot. She had not been taken to the basement. She had not been harmed at all. Police arrived within minutes. Bick was dead at the scene. Han was rushed by air to a trauma unit at a Toronto hospital. He slipped into a coma, and most people did not expect him to wake up. What Jennifer had not planned for was her father opening his eyes again. When Han eventually came out of his coma, he gave police a very different version of events from the one his daughter had given them. He remembered seeing Jennifer in the hallway during the attack. He remembered watching her speak softly and calmly to one of the armed men, like she knew him, like she was not afraid of him at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From that moment on, detectives stopped looking at Jennifer as a victim. They started looking at her as the person behind everything. Her story was about to fall apart in ways she could not control, and what happened in that police interrogation room was the moment the entire plot began unraveling in front of her. Case 2. Samantha Ford Rabon. Samantha Ford Rabon grew up in a small part of South Carolina called Ana in Horry County. This is an area of farmland, country roads, and quiet neighborhoods where people tend to know each other by name. Her father was Robert Marion Ford Jr., who went by Robert. Her half-brother was Robert Stetson Ford, who went by Robbie. By the summer of 2018, Samantha was in her early 30s, and her life had hit a rough patch. She had her own place over near Aina, but according to people who knew the family, she was struggling with money. Her father, on the other hand, was not struggling. Robert Ford was a man who had worked his whole life and saved what he earned. Between land he owned, a bank account, retirement accounts, and life insurance money, he was sitting on an estate worth more than $1 million. For Samantha, that was the problem. It was sitting with him, and she wanted it for herself. There was a wrinkle in her plan, though. Samantha was not her father's only child. Her half-brother Robbie was 25 years old and also a child of Robert Ford. Under the rules of how estates usually get split in a family, if Robert died, Robbie and Samantha would each get half. Half of $1 million is still a lot of money. For most people, that would be more than enough. But prosecutors later said Samantha did not want half. She wanted all of it. And if she could not have it all by simply asking, she was willing to do something else. She was willing to pay another person to make her family disappear. To understand how this came together, you have to understand a little about how plots like this get born in real life. Samantha did not know a professional killer. She did not have shady contacts in a dark corner of the internet. What she had was a cousin named Teresa Martin. Teresa lived right next door to Samantha's mother. Teresa was dating a man named Randy Dean Granger, who was in his mid-50s. Randy had a rough past. He had been in and out of trouble, and he was the kind of man willing to listen when someone offered him cash to do something no one else would do. According to the testimony that later came out in court, Samantha asked Teresa to bring Randy over so she could talk to him. Teresa agreed, and one day, in a quiet meeting that none of the three of them expected to ever become public, Samantha sat down with Randy and made her offer. Her request was very specific. She told him her father had to go. But, she said, her half-brother Robbie also had to go on the same day. And she explained why. If she killed just her father, she said, Robbie would automatically get half the inheritance. She did not want that. Both of them had to be taken out at the same time, because once they were both gone, all of the money would pass to her. Randy, for doing this, would be paid $20,000. That was the deal. Teresa was in the room while this was said. Teresa would later testify to all of this under oath. On top of that, Samantha searched for things online that nobody who plans a peaceful life ever searches. One of her searches was a question about whether it was possible to clean up a double homicide within 4 hours. This search, found on her devices, was later used against her in court. The date chosen was August 17, 2018. It was a Friday. Robert Ford, 59 years old, and Robbie Ford, 25 years old, were at the family home off Highway 19 near Conway, a town in Horry County. Randy drove there with Teresa behind the wheel. She was his getaway driver. Randy went up to the property with a gun and shot both men. Robert was hit twice, including in the head. Robbie was shot in the side and in the back of the head. Both men died in the yard of the home where Robert had lived for years. Randy and Teresa then took Robert's vehicle, a Ford Escape, and drove it away from the house. They tried to cover their tracks by setting the vehicle on fire out in a field off Cook's Circle in a little community called Nichols. Then they went home. The next morning, August 18, 2018, Horry County Police got a call about an abandoned and partly burned vehicle. Officers went to look at it. They ran the plates. The vehicle belonged to Robert Ford Jr. That rang alarm bells. A random torched vehicle registered to a man who nobody had heard from recently was enough for them to go check on him. They drove out to Robert's home on Highway 19. When they arrived at the property, they walked around to the backyard. That is where they found the bodies of Robert Ford and his son Robbie, lying where they had fallen. From the outside, nothing about the scene pointed back to Samantha. She was not at the house. She had not been seen in the area. She had what looked like a clean alibi. For a long time, this case went cold. For almost 2 full years, the Ford murders sat unsolved in the files of Horry County investigators. No arrests, no suspects, no real answers for the Ford family. Anita Hayes, who was Robert's sister and Samantha's own aunt, had to live through one of those years not even knowing who had shot her brother and her nephew. Detectives kept working though. They had one very thin thread that tied back to the scene. Inside and around the burned vehicle, they had found pieces of physical evidence, including cigarette butts and a skull cap. From those items, they were able to pull a sample. It took time and careful lab work, but the sample eventually matched a single man in their database. That man was Randy Granger. Once Randy's name came up, everything else started to unlock. Detectives pulled on that thread and found that Randy was closely tied to Teresa Martin. And Teresa, they learned, was the cousin of a woman named Samantha Rabon. The connection was there. Now they just had to prove it. On the second anniversary of the killings, investigators pulled Teresa in for questioning. That was the moment the whole plan fell apart. Teresa told police that Samantha had asked her to bring Randy to see her. She told police that Samantha had asked Randy, right in front of her, if he would kill her father and her half-brother so she could inherit all of her father's money. Teresa, as a cousin who had been dragged into something she never should have been part of, decided to make a deal. She pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and agreed to testify against both Randy and Samantha in court. Randy was the first to go on trial. In April 2023, a Horry County jury found him guilty on 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of criminal conspiracy, 1 count of third-degree arson, and possession of a weapon during a violent crime. The judge gave him 2 life sentences, running one after the other, with no chance of parole. While he sat in prison, Randy agreed to testify against Samantha at her own trial. He admitted on the stand that part of the reason he was testifying was hope. He was hoping his own life sentence might be reduced if he cooperated. But he also said something very plain and very telling about the woman he had once agreed to work for. He told the jury that Samantha was willing to kill her own family for money, and he raised a question about what she might do next. He asked, out loud, who she would kill next. He even wondered whether her own children would be safe if it ever came to that. Samantha's trial opened on February 21, 2024. For more than a week, the courtroom in Horry County heard testimony that stripped away the clean, innocent picture she had tried to keep of herself. Witnesses from several banks and financial institutions testified about the money she had received after her father and half-brother died. Altogether, more than $1 million in land, retirement funds, investment accounts, insurance payouts, and bank money had moved into Samantha's name. Prosecutors told the jury, in closing, that Samantha had a million reasons to want her father and brother gone. They also showed the jury her online search history, including that chilling question about how long it would take to clean up a double homicide. Her defense tried to argue that it was actually her mother who had masterminded the whole plot, not her. But the jury was not convinced. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours on the morning of February 28, 2024, before walking back into the courtroom with guilty verdicts on all 6 counts. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 2 counts of solicitation to commit a felony. As the verdicts were read, Samantha Rabon cried and shook her head. Her aunt Anita Hayes stood up in the courtroom and told the judge that the murders had broken their family, and that it was heartbreaking to accept that someone they loved had done this. Assistant Solicitor Mary Ellen Walter told the judge that in 30 years of prosecuting cases, she had never seen a crime as cold as this one. She said the willingness to plan the death of the man who gave you life and of your own brother showed what kind of person Samantha really was. Judge Benjamin Culbertson sentenced Samantha Ford Rabon to 2 consecutive life sentences for the 2 murders with no chance of parole. He then added 10 years for each solicitation charge and 5 years for each conspiracy charge, all running one after the other, for a total of an extra 30 years on top of her 2 life sentences. She will die in a South Carolina prison. She will never walk free again. She tried appealing the conviction in late 2024. That appeal is still working its way through the South Carolina Court of Appeals at the time of this video. But her story does not end with her paying for her crimes alone. There is a much bigger question her case leaves behind, about how far someone will go when they think money is worth more than blood. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Because if Samantha Rabon was willing to wipe out her father and her brother to collect an inheritance, the next daughter we are looking at took that same kind of cold thinking and aimed it at the one person the rest of the world would have expected her to love more than anyone else. Her target was her mother, and the place she chose to do it was not a quiet farm road in South Carolina. It was a luxury resort on a tropical island on the other side of the world. Case 3. Heather Mack. Heather Lois Mack was born on October 11, 1995 in Illinois. To understand her story, you first have to understand the kind of life she was born into. Her father was a man named James L. Mack. He was a well-known jazz musician and composer. By the time Heather was born, he was already in his late 60s. Her mother, Sheila Ann von Weiss, was nearly a quarter century younger than him. Sheila came from money. She was the kind of woman who moved in wealthy social circles in the Chicago area, took her family on long European cruises, and expected a certain standard of living. The family lived in Oak Park, Illinois, a nice, leafy suburb just outside of Chicago. On paper, Heather was given everything a child could want. The problem was that the home behind the nice address was not a peaceful one. As Heather grew up, the relationship between her and her mother got worse and worse. This was not a case of the occasional argument that a lot of teenagers have with their parents. This was documented in police files, over and over again. Between January of 2004 and June of 2013, the Oak Park police were called to the Mack family home around 86 times. Almost every one of those calls had to do with fights and violence between Heather and her mother. The reports show that Heather was not the victim in most of these. She was the one being reported. In January of 2010, Heather struck her mother on a broken ankle. In early 2011, she broke her mother's arm and then ripped the phone cord out of the wall so her mother could not call for help. There were other incidents where she bit her mother, threatened her, and was accused of stealing money from her. This was a household in total chaos. In 2006, when Heather was about 10 years old, her life was hit by a major loss. Her father, James, went with the family on a vacation to Greece. While they were there, he passed away in his hotel from a sudden medical issue called a pulmonary embolism. That is when a blood clot blocks an artery in the lungs. It was sudden, it was unexpected, and it left Heather without her father. It also left Sheila and Heather alone with each other. There had already been tension in the house. Now there was no buffer between them at all. On top of that, there was money involved. James had been in a long legal fight with a cruise line over an injury he had suffered years earlier. When that lawsuit was finally settled in 2011, a large chunk of the money ended up in Sheila's hands. Heather would later accuse her mother of cheating her out of an inheritance her father had wanted her to have. By the time she was in high school, Heather was a very different teenager from most of her classmates. She attended Oak Park and River Forest High School between 2010 and 2014. During her senior year, she started dating a young man named Tommy Schaefer. Tommy was about 2 years older than her and called himself a rapper. He was also unemployed. Her mother did not approve of him at all. Sheila was so worried about the relationship that she actually sold the family home and moved the two of them out of Oak Park and into the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago, hoping that putting physical distance between her daughter and Tommy would end things. It did not. Heather and Tommy stayed together. By 2014, Heather was pregnant with his baby. Her mother, according to Heather's lawyer, wanted her to end the pregnancy. The conflict inside that apartment was reaching a breaking point. In August of 2014, Sheila booked one more vacation for the two of them. The destination was Bali, an Indonesian tropical island known for luxury resorts and 5-star hotels. They flew first class. Their destination was the St. Regis Hotel in Nusa Dua, one of the most expensive resorts on the island. For Sheila, it may have felt like a last chance to try to save her relationship with her daughter. For Heather, it was something else entirely. Heather had her own plan for that trip, and her plan was already well in motion before the plane even took off from Chicago. Prosecutors would later lay out the full picture. Heather had already been having conversations with Tommy and with Tommy's cousin, a young man named Robert Bibbs. According to the federal plea deal Bibbs eventually signed, Heather had offered Tommy $50,000 to end her mother's life. Bibbs had known about it. He had offered Tommy advice on how to go about it. He had encouraged him to do it. The motive was clear. Heather was the only child and only heir to a trust fund from her mother, worth around $1.5 million. Before leaving Chicago, Heather took her mother's credit card and used it to book a business-class flight to Bali for Tommy. Sheila did not know he was coming. The plan was for him to arrive on the island after them and meet Heather at the St. Regis. The cover story was that Tommy was flying out to tell Sheila about Heather's pregnancy. Emails later shown in court revealed that was a lie. The real reason he was getting on that plane was the plan the three of them had already made back in the United States. On the night of August 7th, 2014, the St. Regis security cameras recorded something unusual. They caught video of Sheila in the hotel lobby, clearly arguing with Tommy Schaefer. Whatever was said in that lobby, the tension carried back upstairs into the family's hotel room. Shortly after the argument, Sheila was killed inside that hotel room by Tommy using a heavy object. Heather was in the room. After Sheila was gone, Heather and Tommy made their next move. They had brought a large, hard-sided suitcase with them on the trip. They placed Sheila's body inside that suitcase and zipped it shut. Then they rolled it through the hotel, outside to the front of the resort, and loaded it into the trunk of a waiting taxi. Their idea, apparently, was to have the taxi take the suitcase somewhere else while they quietly slipped away. They told the driver they would be right back, then they walked away and did not return. The taxi driver waited and waited, and as he waited, a St. Regis security guard came over to check on the vehicle. That is when the guard spotted something coming from the suitcase in the trunk. The guard told the driver not to leave. He told him to drive the taxi straight to the police station instead. The driver did. When officers opened the suitcase at the station, they found Sheila von Wiesmack inside. It became one of the most talked about crime stories in the world that summer, and the news gave it a name that would stick. They called it the Bali Suitcase Murder. Heather and Tommy had not gone far. They had checked into a cheaper motel nearby, probably planning to figure out their next move. Indonesian police picked them up there. At first, the two of them tried to sell a strange story. They told the police they had been attacked by robbers in their hotel room, that Sheila had been killed in front of them, and that they had just barely escaped. Nothing about the story held up. The security cameras, the suitcase, the taxi driver, and the behaviour of the two of them all told a different story. On August 15th, 2014, both of them were officially designated as prisoners by Indonesian authorities. A few days later, a urine test confirmed that Heather was indeed pregnant. The Indonesian legal system was not known for being gentle. They could have been charged with premeditated murder, which in Indonesia can carry the death penalty by firing squad. In September of 2014, Tommy admitted to killing Sheila, though he tried to explain it by saying Sheila had threatened the unborn child and had attacked him first. Heather admitted to helping him put her mother's body in the suitcase. In January of 2015, both of them were formally charged with premeditated murder. Their trials took place in Bali. While awaiting trial, Heather gave birth to a baby girl, Estelle, who was born in March of 2015 inside an Indonesian jail cell. In April of 2015, the Indonesian court handed down its sentences. Tommy received 18 years in prison. Heather received 10. The judges openly said they were being lenient with Heather because she had just become a mother. Many people watching the case from the United States were stunned. Sheila's brother, Bill Wies, the man who was handling her estate, was outraged. He believed the sentences were far too light. While Heather sat in an Indonesian prison, the legal story kept unfolding back in the United States. In September of 2015, the FBI arrested Tommy's cousin, Robert Bibbs, in Chicago on federal charges. His role in the plot had finally caught up with him. In June of 2017, Bibbs was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. The terms of his plea deal included the detail that Heather had offered Tommy $50,000 to kill her mother. That piece of paper, signed and filed in federal court, locked the plot in writing and made clear that this had not been a sudden act of rage in a hotel room. It had been a contract. It had been a deal for money. And it had been planned back on American soil before the trip to Bali ever began. Heather, meanwhile, was racking up small good behaviour deductions to her Indonesian sentence. Between those and a special 6-month reduction granted by the Indonesian president in August of 2021 to mark the country's Independence Day, Heather was released early on October 29, 2021, having served just under 7 years of her 10-year sentence. She said she wanted to stay in Indonesia with her daughter. She said she believed Bali was a safer place to raise the child than Chicago. Indonesian immigration had no interest in that. Because the child was born to an American mother, she was considered American by law, and both of them were put on a plane and sent home. Heather must have known what was waiting for her back in the United States. The moment she walked off that plane at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport in November of 2021, federal agents were there. They arrested her on federal charges of conspiracy and obstruction tied to her mother's death. She was held in Chicago without bond. Her 6-year-old daughter Estelle was taken into the custody of relatives, while Heather's case moved through the American court system. Unlike her trial in Bali, this trial would not be working with Indonesian laws. It would be working with American federal law, and American federal prosecutors had every intention of making sure she paid a real price for her mother's death. Her federal case moved slowly at first. It was not until June of 2023 that Heather finally gave up. That month, in front of a federal judge in Chicago, she pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiring to kill an American citizen. Under the terms of her plea deal, she faced a maximum of 28 years in federal prison. She did not get the maximum, but she came very close. On January 17, 2024, US District Judge Matthew Kennelly sentenced Heather Mack to 26 years in federal prison. The judge called the killing a brutal, premeditated crime. Heather's uncle, Bill Weiss, spoke in court. He said if it were up to him, Heather would spend the rest of her life behind bars. He told the judge his niece had never shown any real remorse for what she did to his sister. Heather wore an orange jumpsuit to her sentencing and showed very little emotion as she listened. She is now serving her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Hazleton, West Virginia. With good behavior credit, her projected release date is sometime in March of 2044. She will be nearly 50 years old when she walks out, if she ever does. Her daughter Estelle is growing up without her, being raised by a cousin on her mother's side of the family. The $1.5 million trust fund that Heather had originally wanted for herself was settled in court in 2018 and placed in the name of Estelle, meaning the child Heather had been carrying during the murder became the real heir to everything Sheila had left behind. Tommy Schaefer, meanwhile, served 11 years in Indonesia and was deported back to the United States in February of 2026, where he is now facing his own federal charges in Chicago for his role in the conspiracy. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Heather Mack is proof that money can turn a relationship between a mother and daughter into something unrecognizable. She had a wealthy mother, a trust fund already in her name, and a baby on the way. She chose to have her mother killed in a 5-star hotel room on a tropical island, over a $50,000 payment and the promise of full control over an inheritance she was already set to receive. Her case shocked the world, but she was not the only young woman whose greed and entitlement turned into plans for her own family's death. The next case we are going to look at does not take place in a luxury resort. It takes place in a mansion in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in South America, and the daughter at the center of it did not just want to end one life, she wanted to end 2. Case 4. Suzane von Richthofen. Suzane Louise von Richthofen was born on November 3, 1983 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Her life from the very beginning was set up to be something most people in Brazil could only dream of. Her father was Manfred Albert von Richthofen. He was a German engineer who had come to Brazil for work and ended up running very important highway projects for the city of Sao Paulo. He was a director at a state-owned company called Dersa, which managed the city's massive road system, and he was the chief engineer on a huge new beltway project around Sao Paulo. On top of the salary that came with that kind of job, there were rumours, later raised by prosecutors, that Manfred had also moved millions of euros into Swiss bank accounts opened in his daughter's name on her 18th birthday. Her mother, Maricia, was a working psychiatrist. She came from a mix of Lebanese and Italian background in Brazil. The family was supposed to be distantly related to the famous World War I pilot, nicknamed the Red Baron, whose real name was also Manfred von Richthofen. Between the father's career, the mother's profession, and the family name, Suzane was living the kind of childhood that Brazilian society called old money elite. Their declared family fortune was around 5.5 million Brazilian reais, which at the time made them very wealthy by any normal standard in Brazil. The family lived in a mansion in Brooklyn Velo, one of the more desirable neighborhoods of Sao Paulo. Suzane had a younger brother named Andreas. She went to a German school in the city, which is the type of school that wealthy families send their children to when they want them to grow up bilingual, disciplined, and ready for university. After finishing high school, Suzane enrolled in law school at the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo, one of the most respected private universities in the country. By all outward signs, she was the model of a young Brazilian woman from a good family, smart, educated, beautiful, on track for a successful life. In 1999, when Suzane was just 15 years old, she met a young man named Daniel Cravinhos de Paula e Silva. Daniel had been hired to teach her younger brother how to fly model airplanes as a hobby. Suzane and Daniel started talking, started spending time together, and eventually started dating. They even began taking a Brazilian jiu-jitsu class as a couple. In the beginning, her parents did not interfere with the relationship. They figured their daughter was young, this was probably a phase, and it would run its course. But as the months turned into years, they began to look more closely at the young man who kept showing up at their front door, and they did not like what they saw. Daniel Cravinhos did not come from the kind of world the Richthofens moved in. He was from a working-class family. He refused to study. He had no interest in getting a real job. He used marijuana as a regular habit. He had none of the ambition her parents expected in a young man who was dating their daughter. To people like Manfred and Maricia, he was not a match for Suzane. He was a problem. By 2002, their patience had run out. They began trying to block the relationship more seriously. They did not want Daniel in the house. They did not want him around their family, and they certainly did not want their daughter running her life around him. Suzane, who had been given almost everything she had ever asked for in her 18 years, did not respond well to the word no. In July of 2002, while her parents were away on vacation, she actually moved Daniel into the family mansion. Not visiting, not stopping by, moving in. When her parents came home from the trip and found out what she had done, they were furious. Suzane then came up with what she thought was a clever solution. She asked her parents to buy her and Daniel their own apartment, so the two of them could live together, on their own, with the family's financial backing. Her father's answer was firm. He told her that she could do whatever she liked with her life, but only if she earned her own money. He was not going to fund a lifestyle that revolved around a man he did not respect. For Suzane, who had never worked a real job in her life and was used to having everything provided for her, that answer was unbearable. So Suzane kept seeing Daniel in secret, and during those secret meetings between her and Daniel's older brother Christian, the three of them began quietly building a plan. If her parents were gone, Suzane would inherit everything: the mansion, the money, her father's assets. She could live with Daniel as a free woman without anyone telling her what she could or could not do. On top of that, there was the inheritance waiting for her, the millions that were set to become fully hers once both her parents were no longer alive. The three of them agreed. Her parents had to die. And the night they chose to do it was October 31st, 2002. On that night, Suzane waited in the family mansion until she was sure both of her parents were asleep in the primary bedroom. Then she walked through the house and turned off the security alarm system. With the alarm disabled, she went to the front of the home and let Daniel and his brother Christian inside. The two brothers had come armed with iron bars. Suzane stayed downstairs while the two brothers went up the stairs toward the bedroom where her parents were sleeping. Inside that room, Manfred and Maricia were beaten to death with the iron bars. To make sure they did not survive, the attackers also used towels to finish what the bars had started. Both victims were 51 years old at the time, or around that age. and neither of them had any chance to defend themselves. After her parents were gone, Suzane, Daniel and Christian went into cleanup mode. They pulled drawers open, tossed things around, and staged the scene to look like a burglary. They took a certain amount of cash from the home to make the story more believable. Then they split up to build themselves alibis. Suzane and Daniel drove to a motel together, so it would look like the two of them had been out of the house during the attack. Christian went to a fast food place so he could be seen in public. Early the next morning, Suzane and Daniel picked up her younger brother Andreas from an internet cafe where he had been staying up late playing online games. They brought him back home, led him inside, pretended to discover the crime scene together, and then called the police as if they were three grieving people who had just walked in on an unthinkable disaster. The lie fell apart quickly. Sao Paulo police who arrived at the mansion immediately noticed things that did not add up. The attackers seemed to have known the house very well. They knew where to go. They seemed to know the layout. They appeared to have walked through the security system without any trouble. Detectives also noticed something strange about Suzane herself. Her behaviour did not match what a young woman who had just lost both of her parents should look like. The day after the attack, she was seen using the family swimming pool with Daniel. Even more shocking to the detectives, within hours of her parents' funeral, she hosted a birthday party. For investigators, that behaviour was not grief, it was performance, and it was bad performance. Police put Suzane, Daniel and Christian under quiet surveillance, and that is when they caught a major break. Christian Cravinhos, who had no real income and lived a modest life, went out and bought himself a motorcycle. He paid for it using large bills, more money than anyone who knew him believed he could have. That detail pushed everything forward. On November 9th, 2002, just 9 days after the murders, all three of them were brought in for questioning. Under interrogation, their stories cracked open. All three confessed. They admitted to the plan, admitted to their roles, and admitted that the murders had been set up in advance. The trial finally began on July 17, 2006, after years of legal delays, in a courtroom in Sao Paulo. By then, the case had become one of the most famous crime stories in Brazil. Television crews from all over the country showed up at the courthouse. Suzane was now 22 years old. She sat in the courtroom day after day as the prosecution built its case against her. The three defendants quickly turned on each other. Suzane's lawyers tried to argue that Daniel had been the real mastermind and that Suzane had been forced into the plan. Daniel and Christian, in turn, pointed the finger back at Suzane. They said she was the one who had pushed for it, the one who had planned it, and the one who had opened the door for them on the night of October 31st. The lead prosecutor, Roberto Tardelli, rejected any idea that Suzane had been a victim of Daniel's influence. He called her the mastermind of the crime. He told the jury in plain words that Suzane had wanted the family's money and the family's assets, and that she had wanted her freedom and independence without ever having to work for any of it. Tardelli asked for the maximum sentence allowed under Brazilian law, 50 years for each of the three. On July 22, 2006, after a week of testimony, the verdicts came in. The court found Suzane and Daniel guilty and sentenced each of them to 39 years and 6 months in prison. Christian, who had also confessed, was sentenced to 38 years and 6 months. The judge categorized the murders under a special section of Brazilian law called triplamente qualificados, meaning 3 times qualified. That label is reserved for homicides that meet 3 separate aggravating factors. In this case, the cruel way the attack was carried out, the fact that the victims had no chance to defend themselves because they were asleep, and the deeply selfish motive behind the entire plan. It was the most serious classification available. In Brazil, life imprisonment is forbidden by the Constitution, so 39 years is about as close as the system gets to permanent punishment. In 2011, Brazilian courts ruled that because of her conviction for the murder of her parents, Suzane was not allowed to inherit their estate. A judge officially declared her unworthy of the inheritance under Brazilian inheritance law. The millions she had wanted were cut off from her. Still, over the years, questions floated in Brazilian media about the Swiss bank accounts her father had allegedly opened in her name on her 18th birthday, since those technically existed outside the reach of the main estate. Whether that money ever became available to her has never been fully confirmed in public. By 2015, Suzane had been moved from a closed prison regime into a semi-open regime, which in Brazil means she was still considered incarcerated, but had more freedom of movement. In 2018, a judge denied a request to release her completely, writing that she still showed signs of being extremely self-centered and that she had traits of a narcissistic personality disorder that may have driven her original actions. Then, on January 11, 2023, after 20 full years of her original 39-year sentence, a court granted her a progression to what Brazil calls the open regime. In practical terms, that meant she could finish out her sentence outside of prison walls, provided she followed court rules. After her release, she moved first to a small town called Angatuba, then settled down in a municipality called Bragança Paulista. She opened a small embroidery business. In 2023, she announced she was pregnant. In 2024, she gave birth to a son. She is now married to a doctor named Felipe Zacchini Muniz and is living a second life under a new name as Suzane Louise Magnani Muniz. For a lot of people in Brazil, the fact that the woman who had her parents beaten to death at the age of 19 is now a free mother with her own business and her own family is hard to stomach. Her two ex-boyfriends in crime walked free long before her. Daniel Cravinhos was moved into the open regime years before Suzane was, and is now living quietly, working in model airplane and motorcycle customization. His brother Christian had a bumpier road, getting sent back to a closed prison in 2017 after being arrested for trying to bribe police officers during a domestic situation. But even he was eventually allowed back out under supervision. For Suzane, the outcome looked almost like a reset button, a quiet countryside life built on the exact kind of comfort her parents had once worked so hard to give her. The only people who did not get a second chance were Manfred and Marizia, the two people who had built everything that Suzane later tried to take by force. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The von Richthofen case showed the world what happens when a young woman from a mansion decides her wealthy parents are just an obstacle in her way. Her weapons were iron bars in her boyfriend's hands. But the next daughter we are going to look at used a very different kind of weapon, and she used it against a very different kind of family. She was 16 years old, she lived in a tiny Texas town where everyone went to the same church, and when her parents tried to keep her away from the boy she loved, she did not wait to inherit anything. She decided her entire family had to go, including her two little brothers. Case 5. Erin Caffey. Alba, Texas, is one of those small towns most people outside of East Texas have never heard of. In 2008, the entire population sat at around 492 people. It is the kind of place where almost everyone knows each other by name, where most families go to the same handful of churches on Sunday morning, and where news travels faster than any text message. In that tiny community lived the Caffey family. The father was Terry Caffey. He was a youth pastor at Miracle Faith Baptist Church. He was training to become a full minister. His wife Penny worked as a nurse and played piano at the same church. Together they had 3 children. A daughter named Erin, who was 16 years old at the time of this story. A son named Matthew, nicknamed Bubba, who was 13. And a younger son named Tyler, who was 8. The family lived in a cabin on a quiet piece of land. Everything about their life looked peaceful. A Bible verse was even etched into a wooden sign hanging over their driveway. Erin Caffey was the kind of girl that adults in Alba pointed to as an example. She was blonde and petite, with blue-grey eyes and a warm smile. She worked as a car hop at the local Sonic Drive-In, the fast food spot out on the main drag, where she roller skated between cars delivering food. Her pastor once joked that if he had just 5 more girls like her, his church would be full on Sundays. She sang in the church choir, she played flute. Her younger brothers played music too. The whole family was so musical that they regularly performed together at church events. Erin had been homeschooled for 3 years after being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. Her parents wanted her kept close, kept safe, and kept focused on her faith. In December of 2007, they agreed to let her go back to public school. That year, she started at Rains High School. The change of setting would matter because shortly after returning to public school, Erin started working at Sonic. And it was at Sonic that she met the young man who would unravel everything her parents had ever tried to build for her. His name was Charlie Wilkinson. He was 18 years old. He was a local boy from a broken home, living with his father and his stepmother, only seeing his real mother once or twice a year. Charlie was not the kind of young man the Caffeys would have picked for their daughter, but the moment he met Erin, his life started revolving around her. Friends later said that Charlie was completely taken with her. He could not stop talking about her. He drove to Sonic every afternoon during her shifts just to see her. He went to church with her family. He sat by her side at backyard bonfires at the Caffey property. For Erin, it was her first real relationship. She told her aunt that she planned to run away with Charlie as soon as she turned 17. Terry and Penny did not instantly dislike Charlie. In the beginning, they were willing to accept that their daughter had found a first love. What shifted them was a series of small things. Charlie gave Erin a promise ring. It had belonged to his grandmother. Erin wore it during a church function, where Penny noticed it and demanded that Erin give it back, saying the promise was too serious for the two of them at their ages. Erin's grades started slipping. Her aunt eventually told Penny she should take a closer look at Charlie online. Penny went to the local library in town and pulled up Charlie's MySpace profile, the social media site teenagers used back then. What she saw on that page changed everything for her. The page contained references to drinking, partying, and adult themes that Penny found completely inappropriate for a young man dating her 16-year-old daughter. In February of 2008, the Caffeys sat Erin down and put their foot down. Charlie was no longer allowed at their home. She was no longer allowed to see him. Her car was taken away. Her phone use was cut back. For the first time in her life, Erin was being told a firm no. Erin pretended to accept it. On the outside, she was the good daughter again, but on the inside, something had snapped. Around this same time, she started talking with friends about a plan to get rid of her parents. She tried to enlist a previous boyfriend to kill her family. He refused. He was so disturbed by what she had asked that he broke up with her and walked away from the whole thing. Erin then turned to Charlie. Charlie, who was already heartbroken about being banned from the Caffey home, did not say no. According to what prosecutors later presented in court, the two of them spent about a month building a plan. At first, they talked about simply running away together, but Erin kept bringing it back to something darker. At one point, Charlie asked her directly, "What about your little brothers? They would be witnesses." Charlie later said Erin answered him by saying she did not care, "Do what you have to do." On the night of February 29, 2008, going into the early morning hours of March 1st, the plan went into motion. Charlie Wilkinson brought in a friend, a 20-year-old named Charles Wade. Charles Wade brought along his 18-year-old girlfriend, Bobby Johnson. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Charlie and Charles Wade drove to the Caffey property. Erin waited outside in a car with Bobby Johnson. The two young men walked into the family home. What followed inside that house is something that shocked even veteran Texas investigators. Penny Caffey was attacked first. She was hit with gunfire and wounded with a long-bladed sword that Charles Wade had brought with him. 13-year-old Matthew was attacked as well. His last words, before anything else happened to him, were heard by his father from down the hall. He was screaming the name Charlie, asking why his older sister's boyfriend, a young man he had trusted around the family bonfires, was doing this. 8-year-old Tyler was also attacked in the home. Then the attackers turned on the father, Terry Caffey. Terry was hit 5 times by gunfire. He fell in his bedroom. The attackers assumed he was gone. He was not. Through sheer will, Terry Caffey stayed conscious. Before leaving the house, the attackers set fire to the family home. Flames began climbing through the walls. Terry, despite 5 gunshot wounds and the smoke filling the rooms, forced himself to crawl. He later said the one reason he did not give up was because he wanted to live long enough to tell the police who had done this. It took him more than an hour to drag himself across the property and down the road to a neighbour's house. When he finally made it, his neighbours called 911. Terry Caffey was the only surviving member of the Caffey family from that house that night. When sheriff's deputies arrived, Terry told them everything. He named Charlie Wilkinson as the attacker he had recognised. It did not take long for investigators to connect the dots. Hopkins County Chief Deputy Kurt Fisher had actually spotted Charlie's car parked at a rundown mobile home nearby that same morning, on his way to the crime scene. The mobile home belonged to Charles Wade. Deputies went to that trailer and knocked on the door. Inside, they found all four of them, Charlie Wilkinson, Charles Wade, Bobby Johnson, and Erin Caffey, standing there in her pajamas, wide-eyed, pretending to be completely confused about how she had gotten there. Deputies recognized her instantly. Within 24 hours of the attack, all four of them were in custody. At first, Erin tried to spin a story. When deputies were preparing to drive her to the Tyler Hospital, where her father had been airlifted for emergency surgery, she was still telling them she had been kidnapped. Then they got a call en route. New evidence had come in. The story was changing. Erin was no longer a witness. She was a suspect. Deputies put handcuffs on her in the car. She broke down crying and told her grandparents, who were riding with her, that she had nothing to do with any of it. The interrogations kept going. Charlie Wilkinson eventually told detectives that it had been Erin's idea from the start. He told them he had at one point suggested she just run away with him, and that she had refused, saying that what she really wanted was for her mum and dad to be killed. Within a day of the attack, all four defendants were facing 3 counts each of capital murder. The public had a hard time processing what had happened. People who had known Erin her whole life had seen her as sweet, innocent, and religious. She had sung solos in the church choir. She had been a car hop on roller skates at the local Sonic. The idea that this same teenager had spent a month plotting the end of her own family did not make sense to her neighbours, her church, or even to her father. Terry Caffey, recovering in a hospital bed from 5 bullet wounds, had to be told in person by Texas Ranger John Vance what his own daughter had done. Terry fell apart in that moment, one of the most emotionally devastating moments he later described publicly. For a long time afterward, Terry thought about taking his own life. What pulled him back, in his own telling, was his Christian faith. Over time, he chose to forgive Erin, Charlie, Charles Wade, and Bobby Johnson. He even asked prosecutors not to seek the death penalty against Charlie and Charles Wade. He told them plainly that Jesus would have spared their lives, and that killing them would not bring Penny, Matthew, or Tyler back. The legal cases moved fast. The bonds for all 4 defendants were set at $1.5 million each. Erin was tried as an adult, even though she had been 16 at the time of the attack. She was held at the Hopkins County Jail. On January 2, 2009, Erin accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty and received 2 life sentences for her role in the killings, plus additional time. Because of the structure of her plea, she would not be eligible for parole until she was 59 years old. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade, the 2 young men who had carried out the actual killings, also took plea deals to avoid the death penalty. Both of them received life in prison without any chance of parole. Bobby Johnson, who had acted as the getaway driver but had not used a weapon, was sentenced to 40 years in prison. She would become eligible for parole after serving 20 years. In the years since, Erin Caffey has tried in various ways to explain what happened. In 2016, she agreed to sit down for a televised interview with British journalist Piers Morgan for his documentary series about female killers. In that interview, she said she did not believe she deserved the sentence she had received. She claimed she had never wanted anyone to die. She said she had been manipulated. Most people who knew the case found those claims hard to accept. Her own previous boyfriend had gone on record saying she had tried to get him to do the same thing before Charlie came along. And Charlie himself had told investigators, in multiple interviews, that Erin had been the driving force of the plan. One of Charles Wade's accomplices, Bobby Johnson, also described Erin as the mastermind behind everything. For the people of Alba, no version of events Erin told was going to undo what had happened in that house. Terry Caffey, who lost his wife and both of his young sons in a single night, chose a path almost nobody expected. He forgave his daughter publicly. He wrote a book about the experience called Terror by Night. He began traveling around the United States, speaking at churches and public schools about forgiveness and survival. By most recent counts, he has spoken at hundreds of churches and hundreds of schools, sharing his family's story. He has remarried. He has 4 children with his new wife Karen, 1 biological and 3 adopted. He has said that visiting Erin in prison is one of the hardest things he has ever done, but he continues to do it. As of the most recent public reporting, Erin Caffey is still serving her sentence in a Texas prison. She will not be considered for parole for many more years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Caffey case made international headlines because of how perfect the family had looked from the outside. A church-going father, a loving mother, a musical daughter, 2 young brothers, and behind the wooden sign with the Bible verse over the driveway, a 16-year-old who had decided her teenage relationship was more important than the entire family who had raised her. Erin Caffey used a boyfriend and his best friend to carry out her plan in a rural Texas cabin. But the next daughter we are going to look at used her boyfriend in a very different way. She was also 16. She was also furious that her parents would not let her date the man she wanted. But instead of hiding behind a fake kidnapping story, she and her boyfriend filmed themselves on video laughing about the killing they had just done, in a city 1,000 miles away, in a house just off the Las Vegas Strip. Case 6. Sierra Halseth. Sierra Halseth was born into what looked, from the outside, like a well-connected and comfortable Las Vegas family. Her mother was Elizabeth Halseth, a woman who had made real history in the state of Nevada. In 2010, when Sierra was still a young child, her mother became the youngest woman ever elected to the Nevada State Senate at the age of 29. Elizabeth was a rising star in state politics, a Republican senator representing part of the Las Vegas area, often featured in local news stories and political coverage. Her father was Daniel Halseth. He was 45 years old at the time of this story. Daniel and Elizabeth had been married, but they had split up years earlier, and Sierra had been moving between their 2 homes as she grew up. She had siblings, she had extended family, she had, on paper, every advantage that money and a public family name could offer in the state of Nevada. Daniel lived in a quiet northwest Las Vegas neighborhood. His house was the kind of single-story suburban home you would find in any part of the city. Nothing flashy, nothing special, just a regular home on a regular street, tucked into the expanding sprawl of the valley, just outside the bright lights of the Las Vegas Strip. By the time Sierra was a teenager, her parents' relationship had already fallen apart, and Daniel had been through his own share of personal and legal struggles. Sierra would later say that her home life was painful and that she did not feel safe with her father. Those claims became part of her statements in court years later, and she would repeat them publicly at her sentencing. Whether they were accurate or not, they formed the backdrop she used to justify what came next. Regardless of what she believed about her father, the legal system did not accept her claims as an excuse. What she ended up doing to him would become one of the most talked about teenage crime stories of 2021 in the entire United States. The other piece of the story starts in the summer of 2020. Sierra was 15 years old. That was when she met a young man named Aaron Guerrero. Aaron was 18, nearly 3 years older than her. They hit it off quickly, and by the middle of 2020, the two were a couple. Their relationship was intense from the start. They wanted to be together all the time. They posted about each other on social media, but their parents, on both sides, could see that this was not a healthy teenage relationship. It was heading somewhere dangerous. In late 2020, Daniel Halseth contacted Aaron's mother directly. He told her what Sierra and Aaron were planning. The 2 teens wanted to run away from Las Vegas together, drive to Los Angeles, and live there on their own. Daniel was firm. He did not want his teenage daughter running off across state lines with an 18-year-old man. Aaron's mother agreed with him. The 2 parents reached the same decision. The relationship had to end. Sierra and Aaron were told they were not allowed to see each other. Their contact was cut off. For a few months, in late 2020 and early 2021, that rule seemed to hold, but in secret, they were still talking. In secret, they were still planning. By March of 2021, Sierra and Aaron were back together, and more determined than ever to stay together, no matter what the adults in their lives said. They started to put a real plan together, not just a plan to run away, a plan to erase the biggest obstacle between them. Sierra was living with Daniel at the time. Daniel, from her point of view, was the one keeping her and Aaron apart. He was the father who had called the other mother. He was the father whose rules she had to follow. So they decided he had to go. And they did not hide this decision the way other teenagers in other cases in this list tried to hide theirs. They shopped for it. In surveillance footage and store receipts that police later pulled together, you can actually watch Sierra and Erin preparing for what they were going to do. The two of them were caught on camera buying bleach, lighter fluid, gloves, cleaning cloths. These were not random purchases. These were the supplies people buy when they are planning to clean up a scene and destroy evidence. The date they chose was April 7th, 2021. Daniel Halseth was 45 years old. He had no idea that day would be the end of his life. That night, inside his own home in northwest Las Vegas, Sierra and Erin attacked him. The coroner's report, which was later read out in open court, found that Daniel had suffered around 70 stab wounds. After he was gone, the two teens moved his body into the attached garage of the house. Then they did what they had bought the supplies for. They set fire to him and to the garage itself, trying to destroy the evidence of what they had just done. Then, they walked out of the house. They took Daniel's car, a blue Nissan Altima. They took his debit card, and they left Las Vegas, heading east toward Utah. What they did next is the part that shocked the public more than almost anything else about this case. In the days right after the killing, while they were on the road together, Sierra and Erin made videos of themselves on a phone. Not one or two quiet messages, actual YouTube-style videos, the kind teenage couples film all the time to post online as vloggers. In one of the videos that police later pulled off of Sierra's phone, Erin looked into the camera and said the words, "Welcome back to our YouTube channel, day 3 after murdering somebody." Sierra's response in the video was to laugh and say, "Whoa, don't put that on camera." She was laughing. 3 days after what she had just done to her own father, she was laughing into a camera with her boyfriend. While the two of them were driving through the desert and filming themselves, Daniel's family was getting worried. He had stopped answering calls and texts. His mother had not heard from him for a couple of days. She reached out to his landlord and asked the landlord to please go by the house to check on him. Meanwhile, back at the house, other people were also trying to reach Daniel and Sierra. Text messages started piling up on Sierra's phone. One of them read, "Hey Sierra, I am trying to get a hold of your dad. Where is he?" Sierra, still on the road with Erin, replied calmly, saying that his phone had been acting up, but that he was okay, and everything would be fixed by tomorrow night. Over the next few messages, she kept up the lie, until eventually she just stopped replying altogether. On April 9th, 2021, the landlord of Daniel's house went over with another person to carry out the welfare check Daniel's mother had asked for. What they found in that attached garage ended any hope that Daniel was still alive somewhere. His body was inside, severely burned. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department was called in. Homicide detectives took over the scene. They quickly identified Daniel. They also quickly realized that his daughter Sierra and her 18-year-old boyfriend, Erin Guerrero, were missing, along with Daniel's vehicle and his debit card. That is when the manhunt began. Detectives used surveillance footage from Daniel's neighborhood to capture the exact moment the two teens left the house in the blue Nissan Altima. Then they tracked the use of Daniel's debit card at stops along the road. That trail led them east, out of Nevada, across the Utah state line, and into the area around Salt Lake City. 4 days after Daniel's body was discovered, on April 13th, 2021, Salt Lake City police arrested Sierra Halseth and Erin Guerrero in Utah. Neither of them put up much of a fight. Both were brought back to Nevada to face charges. Inside Sierra's phone, detectives found exactly what they needed: photos of the pair during the road trip, photos and videos that made clear the two of them had been more than just on the run. They had been celebrating. Prosecutors in Las Vegas moved fast. Both Sierra and Erin were charged with multiple felonies, including open murder with a deadly weapon, first-degree arson, robbery, and credit card fraud. Because Sierra was only 16 at the time, the state had to make a decision about how to try her. The prosecutors successfully moved to have her tried as an adult in criminal court. That meant Sierra was going to be facing the same charges and the same possible penalties as any adult in the state of Nevada. The case moved through the court system for a little over a year. On May 25, 2022, Sierra Halseth and Erin Guerrero both stood in a Las Vegas courtroom and pleaded guilty to 9 counts each. Murder with a deadly weapon, first-degree arson, robbery with a deadly weapon, credit card fraud, and multiple other related charges. The plea deals were the only reason Erin Guerrero was not facing the death penalty in Nevada. For Sierra, as a minor at the time of the crime, the death penalty was not on the table, but a long prison sentence absolutely was. Sentencing was scheduled a few months later. On October 20th, 2022, the two of them were finally sentenced in Clark County District Court. The courtroom was packed with Daniel Halseth's family and friends. His mother spoke. She told the judge that medication and counselling had not stopped the pain she was living with every day. His sister, Leslie Halseth, told the court she believed both Sierra and Erin should have received the death penalty, even though that was not legally possible in the plea deal. His brothers Thomas and Benjamin also spoke. Benjamin set up a poster board in court with photos of his brother so the judge could see the real person whose life had ended in that garage. Sierra was also given the chance to speak. She stood up with her attorney Michael Samft next to her and read a prepared letter in which she claimed her father had been abusive toward her. She used harsh words to describe him. Her father's family, sitting in the front rows, shook their heads and cried as she read the letter. Erin Guerrero, through his attorney Gabriel Grasso, also read a statement. He apologised to Daniel's family. He said Daniel had not deserved to die the way he did. Then Judge Tiara Jones handed down the sentence. Sierra Halseth was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Erin Guerrero received the exact same sentence. Life with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Sierra, who was 16 when she killed her father, will be nearly 40 years old before she is even eligible to apply for parole. There is no guarantee she will ever get it. If she never does, she will spend the rest of her life inside a Nevada state prison. The Sierra Halseth case became a modern warning story for a lot of reasons. She had a famous mother. She came from a family with a public profile in her state. She had every chance to walk away from her relationship with Erin Guerrero, or to push through the rough years of late adolescence and emerge into adult life with her problems solved through time, therapy, or distance. Instead, she chose to plan the end of her father's life with her boyfriend, and then she filmed herself laughing about it, for an audience she clearly imagined would one day watch the footage. The video of her saying, "Whoa, do not put that on camera," has been viewed all over the internet. It has become the moment people most remember from the case. Years from now, even if Sierra walks out of prison one day as a middle-aged woman, that video will still be out there. Her father will still be gone. Her family will still be broken. And the small northwest Las Vegas home where Daniel Halseth raised his daughter will always be connected to one of the most disturbing teenage cases in the state's history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sierra Halseth chose to end her father's life because she did not want to be told no about her boyfriend. She was 16 years old. She was smart enough to buy the supplies she needed in advance, smart enough to lie through text messages for days, and smart enough to take her father's car and debit cards try to get away. But she was also young enough to believe she could laugh into a phone camera about it and not get caught. The next daughter we are going to look at was even younger than Sierra. She was just 12 years old. She lived in a quiet Canadian town with a family that loved her. She made the same kind of choice Sierra did, about the same kind of forbidden older boyfriend. But what she did, and the age she did it at, made her one of the youngest multiple killers in the entire history of her country. Case 7. Jasmine Richardson. Medicine Hat is a small city in the southeast corner of the Canadian province of Alberta. In 2006, it was the kind of place where children rode bikes up and down the sidewalks after school, where parents did not think twice about letting their kids go to a friend's house for a play date, and where serious crime was something you read about happening in other cities far away. The Richardson family lived on a quiet residential street there. Mark Richardson was 42 years old. He was originally from Eastern Canada, and he worked as a paramedic. His wife Deborah was 48 years old. The two had met years earlier at a gym in Sudbury, Ontario, where they both had been working on putting past struggles behind them. They married, started a family, and eventually moved west to Alberta together to build a better life. They had 2 children, a daughter, Jasmine, who was 12 years old at the time of this story, and a younger son named Tyler Jacob, who everyone called Jacob. He was 8 years old. By all accounts, the Richardson home was a loving one. It was warm, it was organised, it was full of the stuff that defines a normal family in a small Canadian city. Jasmine Richardson was born on October 21st, 1993. From a very young age, she was described by teachers as a bright student. Her grades were strong, she was creative, she liked to write. She was sociable and generally well liked by the other kids in her class. She had a close bond with her younger brother Jacob for most of their childhoods. The family lived a very ordinary life. The parents went to work, the children went to school. On weekends there were family dinners and trips to the mall. Nothing about the Richardson household suggested that one of its members was slowly becoming a danger to the others. But somewhere in her early adolescence, Jasmine started to change. She got into darker music. She started spending more time online, including on websites popular with teenagers going through goth phases. Her style changed. Her interests shifted. At an age when most children are still figuring out who they are, Jasmine was going somewhere her parents did not fully understand. Then came January of 2006. Jasmine was just 12 years old. She was at the Medicine Hat Mall, the main shopping centre in the city, with a group of friends. One of those friends introduced her to a young man she had met online. His name was Jeremy Allen Steinke. Jeremy was 23 years old. That is 11 years older than Jasmine. He was born on January 15, 1983, and had grown up in Medicine Hat. According to later interviews and reporting on the case, Jeremy had endured a very difficult childhood, involving abuse from multiple adults in his life. By his early 20s, he was living a rough, unstable adult life with very little direction. Somewhere along the line, he had started telling people strange stories about himself, like that he was a 300-year-old werewolf. He wore a small vial of blood around his neck. He belonged to online communities for people who enjoyed that kind of dark self-image. He was clearly not a healthy young man for a 12-year-old to be anywhere near. The moment Jasmine's parents found out about Jeremy, they reacted the way any sane parent in that position would. They told Jasmine that she was absolutely not allowed to see him. They took steps to make sure the relationship ended. But Jasmine did not accept the no. She started sneaking out of the house. She started going to punk rock concerts without permission. She was meeting Jeremy in secret around town. She was communicating with him online late at night, on social media sites that were popular in Canada at the time. Her parents caught her more than once. They disciplined her. They grounded her. They took her electronics away. They tried everything to get their 12-year-old daughter away from this 23-year-old man. But every time they tightened their hold, Jasmine pulled harder the other way. She told friends she wanted out. She wanted to live in foster care. She wanted her parents gone. And then she started saying something that the friends who heard it did not take seriously, because it sounded too insane to be real. She told them she was thinking about killing her family. Mark and Deborah Richardson had no idea just how serious their daughter had become. Online, Jasmine sent Jeremy a message that would later become one of the most talked about pieces of evidence in the entire case. She wrote to him that she had a plan. She told him the plan would begin with her killing her parents and end with her living with him. Jeremy responded that he liked the plan, but thought they should get more creative with the details. In the weeks before the attack, the two of them allegedly watched a violent American film about a killer couple on the road, and friends would later testify that the film seemed to influence the mood of their planning. Jasmine also began developing hostility toward her own little brother Jacob. According to what Jeremy would later tell police, he once saw Jasmine strangle Jacob in the family home, and she told people she was embarrassed to have her younger brother with her when they went out in public. Between the two of them, Jeremy and Jasmine built a plan. They picked a date. They picked a method. They picked a way out of town afterward. The date was April 23rd, 2006. That night, Jeremy Steinke drove over to the Richardson home. He was wearing a neoprene mask. He was carrying a blade. Jasmine was inside the house. Her parents were home. Her little brother Jacob was home. Somewhere close to midnight, Jeremy made his way into the basement of the house. What happened next over the following hours is something that the Medicine Hat community has never fully gotten over. Deborah Richardson was in the basement. She was attacked by Jeremy. Mark Richardson, hearing the noise from upstairs, came running down to try to protect his wife. Mark tried to fight back. He even grabbed a screwdriver trying to defend himself, but he was outmatched in the basement. Before he lost consciousness, Mark asked Jeremy why he was doing this. Jeremy's answer, as he later repeated to police, was simple. He said it was what Mark's daughter wanted. Upstairs, 8-year-old Jacob was in his bedroom. Jasmine and Jeremy then turned their attention to him. Both of them would later give slightly different versions of what's happened in that room. In court, prosecutors argued that Jasmine herself took part in what's happened to her brother. For an 8-year-old child to be killed by his own sister, a sister he had looked up to for his whole short life, is not something most human minds are built to understand. The two of them destroyed a piece of their own family that night that no sentence would ever be able to restore. After the attacks, Jasmine and Jeremy left the house together. They were picked up by a friend of Jeremy's, a 19-year-old named Casey Lancaster, who drove them away from the scene in her pickup truck. Casey would later be charged as an accessory for that drive and for helping to get rid of evidence. The next day, April 23rd, a young boy who had been friends with Jacob walked up to the Richardson home for a scheduled playdate. When nobody answered the door the way they usually did, he peeked through a window. What he saw scared him enough to run home. He told his mother. His mother called the police. By about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Medicine Hat police officers were inside the house. They found the bodies of Mark in the basement, Deborah in the basement, and Jacob upstairs. They could not find Jasmine. For a brief time, authorities actually feared that the 12-year-old daughter had also been harmed and that her body might be somewhere else. The whole community was told to be on the lookout for a missing child. Helicopters were dispatched. Alerts went out. Inside Jasmine's school locker, however, investigators found something that changed everything. A stick figure drawing, made by Jasmine herself, showing members of her own family being killed. That drawing flipped the entire investigation. Jasmine was no longer a missing victim. She was a missing suspect. Police focused on tracking her cell phone and on finding Jeremy Steinke, who was already known to the family as the older boyfriend Mark and Deborah had been fighting to keep away from their daughter. Within about 24 hours, police caught up with the pair in a small town in the neighbouring province of Saskatchewan called Leader. It was about 130 kilometres from Medicine Hat, around 80 miles away. Both of them were arrested on April 24, 2006, one day after the murders. Casey Lancaster was charged separately on May 3, 2006, for her role in helping them escape. Because of her age, Jasmine Richardson faced a very different legal path than her boyfriend. Under Canadian law, a 12-year-old cannot be tried as an adult. Her case went through the Youth Criminal Justice Act system. On July 9, 2007, about 15 months after the killings, she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was, and remains, the youngest person in Canadian history to ever be convicted of multiple first-degree murder counts. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the maximum sentence available for a child that young was 10 years. That is exactly what she got. 10 years, split up between a closed custody juvenile facility, then a halfway house, then conditional release under supervision. The maximum penalty possible under the Canadian system. And yet, to millions of people watching the case, 10 years for the killing of 3 people, including an 8-year-old little brother, felt impossible to accept. Jeremy Steinke's path through the courts was much longer. He was tried as an adult. His case went to trial in the Calgary Court of Queen's Bench in 2008. After a trial that laid out the gory details of the plan and the attack, the jury convicted him on December 15, 2008, on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 3 life sentences to be served one after the other, with no chance of parole for 25 years. Jeremy later officially changed his name to Jackson May while in prison. Casey Lancaster, the getaway driver, was sentenced in 2009 to several years in prison as an accessory. Jasmine quietly served her 10 years. The Canadian court system issued a permanent publication ban on many of the specific details of her rehabilitation, her therapy, and the facilities where she was held. On May 6, 2016, Jasmine completed her sentence and was released. She was 22 years old. She had served the exact 10 years given to her under the law, no more, no less. A judge had declared, before her final release, that she had responded to her treatment and no longer represented a serious risk. She was given a new identity, which Canadian law protects for young offenders, and she returned to Canadian society as a free woman. She is reported to have gone on to attend university. In Canadian courts, the legal outcome is considered closed. In the hearts of the many people who followed the case, especially those who knew the Richardson family personally, it is a different story. Many in Medicine Hat have said publicly that they believe she should never have been allowed back into regular life. The Richardson case stands out because of three things that made it almost impossible to process. First, the age of the killer. A 12-year-old girl planning the end of her own family's lives is something that even veteran police officers had rarely seen. Second, the age of one of the victims. Jacob Richardson was 8 years old. He was a happy child with a playdate scheduled for the next morning. He should have grown up, finished school, and built his own life. None of that happened because of choices made by a sister who once loved him. Third, the role of the older boyfriend. Jeremy Steinke was a 23-year-old man. He was legally and morally an adult. He had no business dating a child in 6th grade, but he did, and he went along with her plan, and he carried out the worst of the attack with his own hands. Mark and Deborah Richardson had been trying to protect their family from exactly that kind of adult influence. It ended up costing them their lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jasmine Richardson used a boyfriend 11 years her senior to take out her own family in a quiet Canadian suburb. She was just a child herself when she did it. The next daughter we are going to look at was a little older, but the same pattern was there. She was 16 years old. She lived in a small town in one of the most remote parts of the United States. She was angry with her mother. She used 2 older boyfriends, not one, to carry out her plan. And to make sure she was nowhere near the scene when it happened, she flew out of town to play in a volleyball tournament while her mother was being killed. Case 8. Rochelle Waterman. Craig, Alaska is one of the most remote small towns you will find anywhere in the United States. It sits on Prince of Wales Island, in the southeastern corner of Alaska, closer to Canada than to most of the rest of the state. The population at the time of this story was only around 1,200 people. There are no roads connecting Craig to the outside world. To get on or off the island, you take a ferry, or you fly in on a small plane. Everyone in town knew everyone else. People left their front doors unlocked. Children rode their bikes to school without a second thought. Crime, in the serious sense, was almost unheard of. In this tiny, close-knit community lived the Waterman family. The father was Carl Waterman, who everyone called Doc. He was a retired military veteran who had moved up to Alaska with his wife years earlier. By 2004, he was the president of the local school board, heavily involved in community service and deeply respected in the town. The mother was Lori Waterman. She was 48 years old. She worked as a teacher's aide at the local elementary school. She was known around town as one of the most generous and helpful people you could meet. Her best friend in town, Lorraine Pierce, would later say in court that Lori was her closest friend in the world. Doc and Lori had 2 children, a son named Jeffrey, who, by 2004, had grown up and was attending college out of state, and a daughter named Rochelle. Rochelle Waterman was born in 1988. By November of 2004, she was 16 years old. She was a junior at Craig High School. On paper, she was a model student. She was on the honor roll. She played on the school volleyball team. She was a bright girl with college aspirations. From the outside, she was exactly the kind of kid every small-town parent hopes to raise. But anyone who had been paying close attention to Rochelle in the year leading up to this story would have noticed that she was slowly pulling away from the family that had raised her. She was pushing back against rules at home. She was sneaking out at night. She was going to parties where teenagers in Craig were not supposed to be. She had started a blog online where she wrote angry, dramatic entries about her life. The title of the blog was My Crappy Life. In the tiny world of Craig, Alaska, That blog was a small thing. In the much bigger world of the American internet, the title became one of the most talked about details in the entire case. The real trouble came from her choice in men. By the summer of 2004, Rochelle had started secretly dating a young man named Brian Radel. He was 24 years old. That is an 8-year age gap, and a 16-year-old dating a grown adult is a problem no matter how you frame it. Brian Radel had grown up in a rough home on the other side of Prince of Wales Island, in a small town called Thorn Bay. He had been homeschooled by strict parents who he later described in court as extremely physically abusive. By the time he met Rochelle, he was a young man with very little direction, trying to make his own way in life. Rochelle and Brian dated for a while, but the relationship eventually faded. Before Brian left her life completely, he did something that would later be one of the most important moments of this whole story. He introduced her to his friend Jason Arendt. Jason was also 24 years old. He worked as a janitor at a nearby school. Jason and Rochelle started their own relationship. Doc and Laurie Waterman eventually figured out that their 16-year-old daughter was sneaking around with older men. Doc would later testify in court that his wife Laurie was especially upset about Jason Arendt, not because being a janitor was bad, but because Laurie felt Jason had no ambition in life and was not the right person for their teenage daughter to be wrapped up with. The Watermans grounded Rochelle. They caught her sneaking back into the house early one morning. The next time it happened, they grounded her for a full month. Every normal parenting move these two were making ran right into a wall of teenage rebellion. From inside the house, it looked like a difficult year with a difficult daughter. From somewhere else entirely, from inside Rochelle's private world with Jason Arendt, something much darker was being built. According to what Jason Arendt later told police and testified to under oath, Rochelle told him a series of stories about her mother. She told him Laurie was abusive. She told him her mother had beaten her with a baseball bat. She described her home life as so dangerous, she was afraid for her own safety. Jason took these stories as truth. He became convinced that Laurie Waterman was a serious threat to Rochelle's life. According to Jason, Rochelle eventually told him she wanted her mother out of the picture. Jason was not strong enough or experienced enough to do the job alone, so he reached back out to Brian Radel, the same man who had introduced him to Rochelle in the first place. Jason told Brian that Laurie Waterman needed to die to save Rochelle. Brian would later testify that he only agreed to be part of the plan because he believed, from Jason's stories, that Laurie was going to hurt or kill her daughter. In his mind, he told the court years later, this was about protecting Rochelle, not about pleasing her. The two men, Jason and Brian, started planning it out between themselves. They came up with multiple ideas for how to do it. One idea involved using a plastic container, filling it with cement, and dropping it into the sea. Another involved an explosive device. Another involved a hidden firearm that Brian would use to fire at Laurie from a distance. At one point, Brian actually drove to a spot near Craig High School, ready to take a shot at Laurie as she dropped Rochelle off at volleyball practice. The plan only failed because Brian had forgotten a part of the rifle he needed. Prosecutors would later call that moment attempted murder. Meanwhile, Rochelle herself, according to Jason, had told him when she and her father would both be out of town, so there would be nobody at the home to interfere. The weekend they picked was the weekend of November 13th and 14th, 2004. It was carefully chosen. Doc Waterman was scheduled to fly to Juneau, the state capital, for a board meeting connected to the Girl Scouts program he was heavily involved in. Rochelle was scheduled to fly to Anchorage for a statewide high school volleyball tournament. The Waterman's son, Jeffrey, was already out of state at college. That meant Lowie was going to be alone in the family home in Craig for an entire weekend. Rochelle boarded her flight to Anchorage, Doc boarded his flight to Juneau, Larry stayed in Craig. On Saturday, November 13th, Larry spent the day helping set up a Prince of Wales Chamber of Commerce annual awards banquet. She was a well-liked volunteer in the community, and she was out that evening among friends, doing the kind of small-town work she was known for. She went home late that night. Sometime in the very early hours of Sunday, November 14th, 2004, Brian Radel entered the Waterman home. Without going into the worst details, what happened after that is this. Brian took Larry out of her own home. He made her drink wine first, to make her appear intoxicated. He tied her up using a piece of clothing from inside the house. He loaded her into the back of the family minivan and drove her out of town, all the way down a remote logging road deep into the wilderness of Prince of Wales Island. At some point along the way, Jason Arendt joined him. The two men had planned to stage what would look like a drunk driving crash. It did not go the way they had hoped. Their attempt to make it look like an accident failed. Laurie, despite being heavily outnumbered, fought for her life. By the end of it, her injuries no longer matched a car accident story. The two men made a new decision on the spot. They doused the minivan with gasoline and set it and Laurie on fire. Then they walked away and left the vehicle burning on that logging road, miles from anything. Later that same Sunday, November 14th, hunters out in the woods spotted the smouldering wreckage of the minivan on the logging road. Retired Alaska State Trooper Robert Klaus, who was on duty at the Craig police station, got the call. When he arrived, the vehicle was still smoking. Inside it were human remains in the back seat. At first, investigators were not sure what they were looking at. They arrived home around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The minivan was gone. Laurie was gone. Doc at first assumed Laurie was out running errands or helping a friend, as she often was. As the hours went by with no word from her, he grew worried. By that Sunday night, he had called the police. Rochelle was there with him. The only unusual thing Rochelle pointed out was a bottle of wine that had been left open in the kitchen. She said her mother never drank. That detail would become very important later. On Monday, November 15th, the whole town of Craig learned that Laurie Waterman was missing and that a minivan had been found burning. Rochelle went to school that morning. A gym teacher, Shane Westfall, later told a jury he saw her arrive at her 8 o'clock lifetime sports class and that she seemed normal. During the school day, a special education teacher at Craig High named Don Pierce was asked to take Rochelle home from school because she was crying in the office. When Don went to pick her up, he found Jason Arendt, the 24-year-old boyfriend, already there in the counsellor's office, trying to be alone with Rochelle and insisting he be the one to care for her. Don did not let that happen. He drove Rochelle home instead. That detail, a 24-year-old adult showing up at the high school to comfort a 16-year-old student while her mother was missing, set off alarm bells. Later that afternoon, Craig Police Chief Jim C. came to the Waterman house. He told Doc that the burning minivan had been identified as the family minivan and that a body was inside it. Doc Waterman, according to his own testimony, told the chief in a steady voice that they would have to assume the body was Laurie's. The Alaska State Troopers moved fast. On the evening of November 17, 2004, 3 days after the body was found, Troopers Robert Klaus and Robert McFerrin drove to the Waterman home and asked Rochelle to come down to the police station for questioning. Doc gave permission. Rochelle agreed. What she did not know was that Jason Arendt and Brian Radel were being looked at too. A few hours later, troopers interviewed Brian Radel. Brian confessed. He admitted what he had done. He also told them what he believed, that he had been acting to protect Rochelle from an abusive mother, based on what Jason had told him. The next day, November 18th, troopers interviewed Jason Arendt. Jason also confessed. And Jason told them something extra. He told them Rochelle had wanted her mother dead. He told them she had told him so. He told them she had even told him when her family would be out of town, so the job could be done. On November 19th, 2004, troopers and Craig police brought Rochelle back to the police station for a second interview. She was read her Miranda rights. She was told she had the right to have her father present. She declined to have Doc in the room. Over the course of a long interrogation, Rochelle admitted things that would later be used against her at trial. She admitted she had told Jason her mother was abusive, even though it was not fully true. She admitted she had known Jason wanted her mother dead. She admitted she had told him when her family would be out of town. She denied that she had ever actually wanted her mother killed. She said she thought it was all just talk. At the end of the interview, she was arrested. Jason Arendt was arrested the same day. Brian Radel had already been arrested the day before. All three were charged with multiple counts including first and second-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and burglary. Brian Radel pleaded guilty first. In June of 2005, he accepted a deal. He admitted to the murder. He received a 99-year prison sentence. Jason Arendt also pleaded guilty. He received 50 years. Both men agreed to testify against Rochelle at her trial. Rochelle's first trial began in Juneau in early 2006. Rochelle was just 17 years old by then. Both Brian and Jason testified against her, describing the plans, the stories of abuse, the timing of the weekend, and Rochelle's knowledge of the plot. Rochelle's defense argued that Jason Arendt had manipulated both Brian and Rochelle, that he was an older, obsessive man who wanted Laurie out of the way so he could have Rochelle to himself, and that Rochelle's statements to police had been squeezed out of a scared 16-year-old girl who had been interrogated without her father in the room. The jury of that first trial could not agree. They deadlocked. The split was 10 jurors voting for acquittal, 2 voting for conviction. It was a hung jury. The judge declared a mistrial. The state of Alaska did not give up. Because of heavy media coverage throughout southeast Alaska, the judge moved the retrial all the way to Anchorage, a big city several hundred miles from Craig. The second trial began in late January of 2011, more than 6 years after Laurie's death. By this point, Rochelle was 22 years old. Brian Riddell testified again. Jason Arendt refused to testify in the retrial, saying he had taken a stand and was going to stick by it. So the jury heard Jason's earlier testimony read into the record. Doc Waterman, Rochelle's father, also took the stand in her defense. He did something remarkable. He told the jury that even though his wife was gone, he believed his daughter was innocent. He told them he had never seen any abuse by Laurie against Rochelle. He said he had found a letter from Laurie to Rochelle in Rochelle's nightstand after the arrest, in which Laurie told her daughter she loved her. The judge allowed the letter into evidence. On February 17, 2011, the retrial jury came back with its verdict. It was a split decision. Rochelle was acquitted on 6 of the 7 counts. She was not convicted of first-degree murder. She was not convicted of second-degree murder. She was not convicted of kidnapping. She was not convicted of burglary. She was not convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. On the 7th count, the jury found her guilty of one thing: criminally negligent homicide. That is a far lesser charge. It basically means the jury believed Rochelle had known something serious was being planned and had failed to prevent it, but did not believe she had personally intended or planned the killing. In July of 2011, a judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison for criminally negligent homicide. Rochelle served her 3 years. She was released in 2014. In 2015, the Alaska Court of Appeals denied her appeal of her conviction, in which her lawyers had argued that she should not have been tried as an adult when she was 16. The appeals court pointed out that Alaska state law allows 16-year-olds to be tried as adults in cases as serious as homicide. Since her release, Rochelle Waterman has built a new life for herself away from Alaska. She has not granted major interviews. Brian Riddell remains in prison on a 99-year sentence. Jason Arendt remains in prison on a 50-year sentence. Both men will likely spend most of the rest of their adult lives behind bars because of a plan that, from the very beginning, was built around stories told about a mother by her own daughter. The Waterman case divides people to this day. Some who followed it closely believe Rochelle was exactly what Jason Arendt described, a girl who wanted her mother gone and used the adult men who loved her to make it happen. Others believe Rochelle was what her father testified she was, a troubled teenager who had said reckless things online and made up tall tales to impress older men, and whose reckless words got hijacked by a much more dangerous adult. What everyone agrees on is that Laurie Waterman, a volunteer mother in a town of 1,200 people, did not deserve what happened to her on that quiet Sunday morning of November 14th, 2004. Her life ended on a logging road, alone, hours before her daughter would fly home from a volleyball tournament on the other side of Alaska. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rochelle Waterman used 2 adult men and a weekend away from home to arrange her mother's death in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. But the next daughter we are going to look at did not leave the house when it was time. She did not fly away to another city. She did not wait in a motel room with a boyfriend to build an alibi. She stayed. she grabbed a blade herself, and with her girlfriend by her side, she carried out the killing of the two people who had taken her in and raised her as their own. Case 9. Holly Harvey. Fayetteville, Georgia is a quiet suburb south of Atlanta. In 2004, it was the kind of town where most of the people you passed on the sidewalk probably went to one of the local churches on Sunday mornings. People knew their neighbors. Older folks watched the news at night and drank coffee with friends on the porch in the evenings. In this peaceful Fayette County neighborhood lived an older couple named Carl and Sarah Collier. Carl was 74 years old. He had spent most of his working life at Delta Airlines and had retired as an airline supervisor before picking up painting houses part-time to stay busy. Sarah was 73 years old. She had been a retired bank teller. She was known around town as a homemaker, a church member, and a calm, gentle woman. The two of them had been together for decades. They had built a quiet, stable home together. They had also, decades earlier, adopted 2 children. One of those adopted children had a daughter of her own, a teenage girl named Holly Ann Harvey. Holly was born into a life that was the complete opposite of what the Colliers stood for. Her mother, Carla, had struggled with serious drug addiction for most of Holly's childhood. Holly moved around a lot. She bounced between homes. She lived through instability and chaos that no child should have to live through. By early 2004, when Holly was 15 years old, her mother Carla was sent to prison on a drug-related conviction. Holly suddenly had nowhere to live. That is when the Colliers stepped in. They were her grandparents. They loved her. They wanted her to have a real chance in life. In April of 2004, they took Holly in and gave her a bedroom in the basement of their Fayetteville home. Their hope was simple: a stable home, a church family, regular rules, real food, a clean break from the chaos she had grown up inside. They believed, like a lot of grandparents in the same situation, that they could save her. Holly saw things differently. She had just turned 15. She had already been using alcohol and drugs. She did not want to go to church. She did not want to follow rules. She did not want anyone telling her what to do. She especially did not want to be separated from the one person she cared about most in the world. That person was a 16-year-old girl named Sandra Ketchum, who everyone called Sandy. Holly and Sandy had been close friends since they were about 13 years old. By the time Holly moved in with her grandparents, Sandy was her girlfriend. Sandy had her own difficult background. Her father had been married multiple times, and a few of the women in and out of the home had treated Sandy badly. Both girls felt unwanted, unloved, and misunderstood by the adults in their lives. They had each other, and that was just about it. The Colliers did not approve of the relationship. For Carl and Sarah, who came from a generation and a church community that did not accept same-sex relationships, Sandy was a problem. They also saw the bigger picture. Holly was using drugs, she was rebelling, she was already on a dangerous path, and Sandy seemed like part of that path. They told Holly she was not allowed to see Sandy anymore. They put limits on her freedom. They demanded she stay off drugs. They insisted she go to church with them. Holly rebelled against every single one of those rules. She snuck out. She lied. She picked up phones that were not supposed to be hers. And all the while, her attitude inside the house was getting worse. She was openly hostile to the 2 people who had taken her in. She was arguing with her grandmother Sarah. She was lashing out at her grandfather Carl. By late July of 2004, just 3 months after Holly moved in, things had become so bad that Carl did something very serious. He went to his adopted son, Holly's uncle Kevin, and he told him that Holly had been saying out loud that she wanted him and Sarah dead. He said it in plain words. He told his own son to be ready for something bad. Holly had already started writing her feelings down. Police later found a poem she had written. It talked about her depression. It talked about how she cried herself to sleep at night. It talked about wanting everyone around her to suffer as much as she was suffering. And in one of the lines, the poem contained these words: "All I want to do is kill." That line would later become famous across the country when the case made national news. Holly was not hiding her anger. She was telling her friends about it. She was telling her girlfriend about it. She had even started asking around her social circle about how to get hold of a firearm. She and Sandy were openly talking about wanting to kill Carl and Sarah. The teenagers around them, for the most part, thought it was dark teenage talk. They did not believe two 15 and 16-year-old girls would actually go through with it. The date was August 2nd, 2004. On that night, Holly snuck Sandy into the Collier home. Sandy was not supposed to be there at all. The two girls spent the evening together in Holly's basement bedroom. They smoked marijuana, some of it laced with another drug. They played music. They started talking about their plan. The plan was simple and ugly. They wanted to take the Collier's truck. They wanted to drive away from Fayetteville. They wanted to get to somewhere far enough away that nobody would find them. And both girls understood that Carl and Sarah would never just hand over the keys to the family truck. Sandy, according to later court testimony, said out loud that if they wanted the truck, they were going to have to kill Carl and Sarah to get it. Holly later told a judge that she had responded by agreeing, but had not really meant it. The next hour would prove otherwise. Before the grandparents came downstairs, Holly did something that, to anyone who later looked at it, was a piece of evidence in itself. She wrote a list on her own arm. 4 words, marked on her skin as if she were writing a shopping list. Kill, keys, money, jewelry. That list, later photographed by police, became one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the entire case. It was a checklist. It had the order right there. First step was the killing, then the keys to the truck, then any cash in the house, then any valuables worth taking. At some point that evening, the smell of marijuana drifted up from the basement into the main part of the house. Carl and Sarah Collier, a retired couple in their 70s, who were already worried about their granddaughter, came down the basement stairs to see what was going on. What met them was not a confrontation, it was an ambush. Sandy was hidden behind a bed, holding a blade. Holly was also holding a blade, concealed on her body. When Carl and Sarah entered the basement bedroom, an argument broke out almost immediately. Holly turned on her grandmother first. According to court testimony, she stabbed Sarah in the back. Sarah screamed. Carl Collier, who was 74 years old, reacted instantly. He turned, he punched Holly in the face to try to stop her, and he wrestled her toward the bed to try to pin her down. Holly shouted for her girlfriend to help her. Sandy came out from behind the bed. Now there were 2 attackers, both with blades, facing an elderly couple. Carl was stabbed in the chest as he tried to protect his wife. Sarah was stabbed multiple more times. In the chaos of that basement, the Colliers tried to fight back. Sarah had raised her arms to defend herself, leaving defensive wounds. Eventually, Sarah lost consciousness on the basement floor. She had been stabbed more than 20 times. Carl, bleeding heavily but still on his feet, managed to break away and run up the basement stairs toward the kitchen. He was trying to reach a phone. He was trying to call for help. Holly chased him up the stairs. When she got to the kitchen, Carl picked up a coffee cup and threw it at her. It did not stop her. Holly attacked her grandfather in his own kitchen. Carl fell face down on the floor. He had been stabbed more than a dozen times. What the 2 girls did next was exactly what Holly's arm had said they would do. They went for the keys. They went for the money. They went for the jewelry. They took Carl's wallet. They took Sarah's rings and any valuables they could find quickly. And then they took the Collier's truck and drove out of the driveway, leaving Carl and Sarah behind. Holly was wearing clothes stained with what had just happened. Sandy was as well. Instead of hiding, they did something most people did not expect. They called their friends. They bragged. They told people what they had done. They drove around South Georgia making phone calls, some of them using Holly's uncle's phone. They eventually ended up on Tybee Island, a beach town on the Georgia coast about 4 hours away from Fayetteville, where they tried to trade some of the jewelry they had taken for cash with 2 brothers they had just met. They were loud. They were reckless. They were not hiding. Meanwhile, back in Fayetteville, Holly's uncle Kevin Collier, the same Kevin his father Carl had warned just days earlier about Holly's threats, received a worried phone call from a family friend on the evening of August 2nd. He drove over to his parents' house. What he found inside that home ended his world. Sarah was in the basement. Carl was in the kitchen. Their truck was gone. Their granddaughter Holly was gone. He knew exactly what had happened, because his father had already told him. Kevin called the Fayette County Sheriff's Office. Deputies flooded the scene. They knew who to look for. They put out an alert for the truck, for Holly, and for Sandy Ketchum. Because the girls had been calling friends from the road, detectives were able to track their cell phone pings south toward the coast. By the next day, August 3rd, 2004, they had been tracked to Tybee Island. Police moved in and arrested the two of them without a fight. Investigators found the blades they had used. They found the truck. They found the stolen valuables. When an officer later asked Holly why she had done what she did, she gave an answer that would be repeated in every news story about the case. She said she had done it for Sandy, so the two of them could be together. When police brought the two girls in, Sandy began cooperating almost right away. She gave detectives a detailed account of what had happened in the basement and in the kitchen. Holly was far less cooperative at first, although she eventually agreed, as part of a negotiated plea, to describe her actions to a judge. Both teenagers were charged as adults in Fayette County. On September 15, 2004, a grand jury indicted Holly on 2 counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, and 1 count of armed robbery. Sandy was indicted on similar counts. The funeral for Carl and Sarah Collier drew close to 1,000 mourners. The shockwave that this case sent through Fayette County was enormous. 2 elderly, church-going grandparents, whose only mistake had been to open their home to a struggling granddaughter, had been killed inside their own walls by that very granddaughter and her girlfriend. The trials were split because each of the girls had made statements about the other that could be used against the other in court. In April of 2005, Holly Harvey pleaded guilty in Fayette County Superior Court to 2 counts of malice murder and related charges. Judge Pascal English, who had presided over the case, gave her 2 consecutive life sentences. Because of her age, and because of the way Georgia's sentencing guidelines worked at the time, Holly would become eligible to apply for parole, but only after serving a very long minimum. Sandy Ketchum pleaded guilty to her own charges, including murder and armed robbery. She received 3 concurrent life sentences, meaning they would run at the same time rather than one after the other. She became eligible to apply for parole after serving a minimum of 14 years. Both girls have gone very different directions since. Sandy Ketchum served her minimum time. Public records suggest she was eventually granted parole and released. She has kept an extremely low profile since. Her last known location is somewhere in Georgia. Holly Harvey has not been so lucky. She has remained incarcerated at the Lee Arundel State Prison in Alto, Georgia, which is a women's correctional facility in the north part of the state. Holly first became parole eligible in 2024. She applied. Her request for parole has not yet resulted in her release, as of the most recent public record. She has tried, through the Georgia Supreme Court, to appeal her conviction and ask for a reduced sentence, arguing she should have been considered for a manslaughter charge instead. Those appeals have been rejected. She is, to this day, serving her 2 consecutive life sentences inside the state of Georgia. Both Holly and Sandy have, at different times, expressed regret for what they did. In interviews connected to true crime documentaries, Holly in particular has spoken about growing up behind bars. She has said that she was very young, very angry, very high, and very confused when she agreed to do what she did. She has said she does not expect the public to forgive her. None of that changes the fact that Carl and Sarah Collier are gone. Their home in Fayetteville sat empty for a long time after the killings. The people who knew them best, including their son Kevin, who found their bodies, had to live through the worst day of their lives for no reason other than a 15-year-old's belief that her grandparents were trying to keep her apart from her girlfriend. Carl and Sarah had opened their home to try to save a child who had been dealt a bad hand in life. Instead of saving her, they were killed by her inside that same home. The Holly Harvey case is one of the most quoted in modern true crime writing because of that list written on her arm. Kill, keys, money, jewellery. 4 words, a plan, carried out exactly in that order by 2 teenagers who believed, for a few hours of drugs and teenage confusion, that they were going to drive away and live happily together. They did not make it 24 hours. They were caught, they were convicted, they were sentenced, and they became a warning story for every grandparent, every parent, and every community member who has ever worried about a teenager they cannot seem to reach. There was nothing that Carl and Sarah Collier could have done differently in those final months of their lives that would have saved them. They had done the loving thing. They had taken her in. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next daughter we are going to look at closes out our list, and her case takes us all the way back to 1975, to a quiet California suburb that looked just like the neighborhoods we would expect a happy middle-class family to live in. She was 16 years old. She was adopted, and when her parents tried to pull her back from a life she was running toward at full speed, she convinced her 20-year-old boyfriend to make sure her parents could never stop her again. Case 10. Marlene Olive. Marlene Louise Olive was born in Norfolk, Virginia on January 15, 1959. Her birth mother was an unwed teenager who could not keep her. Within a few weeks, baby Marlene was placed up for adoption. She was taken home by a middle-aged couple from out of state who had been trying for years to have a child of their own without success. Their names were James and Naomi Olive. Friends called him Jim. Jim worked as a marketing executive for large oil companies, first Tenneco, then Gulf Oil. Those jobs paid well, and they came with international postings. Not long after Marlene was adopted, the Olives packed up their lives and moved overseas to Ecuador in South America. Marlene spent almost her entire childhood in a city called Guayaquil. By the accounts of people who knew the family back then, little Marlene and her father Jim had a close, loving bond. He was the parent she looked up to. Her relationship with her mother Naomi was far more complicated from the beginning. Naomi struggled with alcohol addiction. She also suffered from serious mental illness that those close to the family described as schizophrenia. Naomi was often in and out of hospitals. The home life behind their front door was not the warm picture their neighbours imagined. In 1973, when Marlene was 14 years old, everything changed. Jim Olive lost his overseas job. The family had to return to the United States. They settled in a quiet middle-class neighborhood called Terra Linda, part of the city of San Rafael in Marin County, California, just north of San Francisco. Their new house sat at 353 Hibiscus Way. It was a clean, simple, one-story suburban home. To anyone driving past, it looked exactly like the kind of place where a happy American family lived. Marlene hated it. She missed South America. She missed her old friends, her old language, her old life. Back in the United States, she suddenly felt like a complete outsider. She did not know how to dress like American teenagers. She did not know their music. She had grown up in a totally different world, and now she was being told to fit in with kids who had never lived a day outside of California. And while she was trying to adjust to all of that, her relationship with her mother Naomi got much, much worse. Arguments between them became daily events. Some turned physical. Marlene also started turning against her father Jim, because every time there was a fight, Jim took his wife's side. By 1974, Marlene had started going in a very dangerous direction. She was 15 years old, and she was trying everything her parents had ever warned her against. She was using drugs, including LSD. She was shoplifting clothes and makeup from local stores. She was using her parents' credit cards without permission. She was running away from home, sometimes for days at a time. She was writing poems and journal entries about how much she hated her mother. She even told friends, more than once, that she wanted both her parents dead. She asked multiple boys she knew to help her do it. Some of them thought she was joking. Some of them did not take her seriously. Some of them laughed it off. Not a single one of them told an adult. At one point, Marlene even took a different approach on her own. She mixed large doses of prescription drugs from the bathroom cabinet into her mother's food, trying to make it look like an overdose. The drugs made the food taste bitter, and Naomi refused to eat it. The attempt failed, and nobody outside the home knew she had even tried. In the summer of 1974, Marlene met a young man at Terra Linda High School. His name was Charles David Riley, but everyone called him Chuck. He was 19 years old. He was heavy-set, weighing over 300 pounds. He was socially awkward. He had no girlfriends in his past. He was selling small amounts of marijuana around Marin County, trying to be accepted by the cool crowd. The first day he saw Marlene, she was reportedly having her first experience with LSD out on the front lawn of the school. Chuck was instantly taken with her. From that first moment, he made Marlene the center of his entire life. He bought her things. He gave her drugs for free. He drove her anywhere she wanted to go. He stole things from stores for her as gifts. He did whatever she asked. Within weeks, the two were in a relationship. By every account from people who knew them, it was not a healthy couple. It was a setup where Marlene gave orders and Chuck obeyed them. Chuck was so attached to her that when she broke up with him twice during that year, he attempted to take his own life both times. He would do anything to get her back, and Marlene knew it. By early 1975, Marlene and Chuck had gone on a major shoplifting spree together. They stole around $6,000 worth of goods, mostly women's clothing and accessories. That is the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. On March 26, 1975, both of them were arrested and charged with grand larceny. Jim Olive paid to bail them out. He warned Chuck, clearly, to stay away from his daughter. He warned Marlene that if her behaviour continued, she was going to be sent away to a juvenile facility. For Marlene, being sent away felt like the worst threat imaginable. It meant losing everything she wanted. It meant the end of her freedom. It meant the end of her relationship with Chuck. She started telling Chuck that her mother was the real problem. She convinced him, over the course of weeks, that Naomi was abusive, out of control, and needed to be removed from the picture. She told him that if her mother was gone, she would be free to be with him. Chuck believed every word of it. The plan was not subtle. Marlene asked Chuck to take the lives of her parents. Chuck agreed. On the afternoon of June 21, 1975, Marlene went out on a planned shopping trip with her father Jim to keep him busy and away from the house. While they were gone, Chuck Riley entered the Olive home on Hibiscus Way. He was carrying a claw hammer and a small caliber firearm. Naomi was inside. Chuck attacked her in the family sewing room. Later, after Jim and Marlene returned home, Jim was attacked in the house as well. Both parents were gone by the end of that afternoon. Jim was 44 years old. Naomi was 57. What Marlene and Chuck did next is the reason the case picked up the nickname that it has carried ever since. They rolled the bodies of Jim and Naomi into rugs from the house. They loaded them into the family car. They drove 20 minutes away, up into the hills of a park called China Camp State Park, where there was an abandoned old sewage and fire pit just off the side of a service road. They dumped the rugs into that pit, doused them with gasoline, and set the whole thing on fire. Then they went home. Over the next 4 days, Marlene and Chuck did something that made even hardened police officers shake their heads later. They moved into the Olive family home as a couple. They partied. They went to concerts. They ordered pizzas and takeout on Jim and Naomi's credit cards. They acted like the house belonged to them, because in their minds, it now did. Meanwhile, in the early morning hours of June 25, 1975, a firefighter named Vink Tarini responded to reports of a blaze still smoking in the old pit at China Camp State Park. Vink figured it was just another case of hunters who had used the pit to roast deer, as people sometimes did. He did not think much of it. He tossed some ashes around, hosed the area down, and went back to work. It would take over a week for anyone to realise what had actually burned in that pit. Back in Terra Linda, friends and business partners of Jim Olive had noticed that Jim had missed several important meetings. He was not the kind of man who missed meetings. His co-workers got worried and called the San Rafael police. The San Rafael police found the house empty. Marlene and Chuck were not there. Neighbours said they had seen the teenagers coming and going for days, but Jim and Naomi had not been seen in about a week. Officers began looking for Marlene and Chuck. When they finally caught up with Marlene, she came to the police station voluntarily. She gave them story after story, none of them matching the last. First she told officers her parents had gone on vacation and had never come back. Then she told them the Hells Angels motorcycle gang had kidnapped and killed her parents. Eventually, after enough pressure, she led detectives to the fire pit at China Camp State Park. Investigators returned there accompanied by Dr. Roger Hagler, a professor of physical anthropology at San Francisco State University, who specialized in identifying burned human remains. That is when the truth came out. The ashes that a firefighter had casually hosed down a week earlier contained what was left of Jim and Naomi Olive. Chuck Riley was brought in. Under questioning, Chuck broke almost immediately. He gave a full, detailed confession. He admitted to attacking Naomi in the house with the hammer. He admitted to later shooting Jim. He said the plan had been Marlene's from the beginning. He said she had manipulated him into doing it. The San Francisco Chronicle and the Marin Independent Journal, the two main newspapers covering the case, gave it a nickname that stuck. They called it the barbecue murders because of how the bodies had been burned in the barbecue-style fire pit. That name went international. The case became one of the most talked-about crime stories of the 1970s in California. The two of them were charged very differently, and that is where this case became one of the most controversial examples of how American law handles age. Chuck Riley, who was 20 at the time, was tried as an adult. His trial began on October 30th, 1975, in Marin County Superior Court. It lasted 7 weeks. The jury found him guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. On January 26, 1976, he was sentenced to death. That sentence was later reduced after the California Supreme Court ruled the state's death penalty statute unconstitutional. Chuck's sentence became 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole. He was sent to the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. He has applied for parole over a dozen times and been denied nearly every time. Decades of hearings have gone by. He has earned his high school diploma, his associate degree, and his bachelor's degree while in prison. Marlene, on the other hand, was tried as a juvenile because she was only 16. She was sentenced to serve somewhere between 3 to 6 years at the California Youth Authority facility in Ventura, known as the Ventura School. She was released at the age of 21, having served just over 4 years total. The person who had come up with the plan and manipulated the person who carried it out spent less than 5 years locked up. The person who carried it out has been in prison for nearly 50 years. Marlene did not rebuild her life into anything stable after her release. She spent the next several decades in and out of trouble. She escaped from a holding cell in Los Angeles just before her release. She moved to New York and worked in the sex trade while continuing to use heavy drugs. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, she was arrested repeatedly for passing bad checks, credit card fraud, and running identity theft and counterfeiting operations. In 2003, she was arrested in Bakersfield on suspicion of being under the influence of drugs and possessing stolen property and counterfeit checks. She received a 9-year sentence for that. Her life has been a long, slow tragedy. Her case became the subject of a famous true crime book called Bad Blood by Richard M. Levine, published in 1982, which was a bestseller. She has also been the subject of artwork, documentaries, and numerous articles. For many people who followed her case, the biggest lesson was how young age can drastically change an outcome. Marlene was the planner. Chuck was the follower. She got 4 years. He got life. That imbalance is the single biggest reason this case is still studied in American law schools today. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.